Let's pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. Well, I know I'm tipping my hand a little bit when I say this, but I am very glad that Jacob was not my younger brother. Now, if we just went by what we heard from Genesis 32 today, this is page 27 in the Blue Bibles. We'll be spending most of our time in Genesis this morning. If we just based that on what we heard from Genesis 32, that might seem like a bit of an odd thing to say, right? I mean, what did Jacob do? I mean, in Genesis 32, it's easy to even feel a bit sorry for Jacob. I mean, here he is, coming home after almost 20 years away from his family, and it looks like instead of giving him a hug, his big, bad elder brother Esau is going to attack him with an army of 400 men. Verse 7 says Jacob is greatly afraid by what he sees coming at him. So afraid that he divides up his family and his possessions into two camps with the idea that at least someone will survive Esau's onslaught. And Jacob is so afraid that in an effort to buy his brother off before he gets there, verses 13 through 19, we didn't read them, they get a little bit repetitive, but verses 13 through 19 here in Genesis 32 describes how he sends gift after gift ahead of him to his brother. But, as is often the case with younger brothers, and I swear, as an older brother myself, I am not being biased in the least here. Things are not exactly what they seem. Jacob is, in fact, getting exactly what he deserves. So you see, it turns out that Jacob is a bit of a conniver. He's like one of those contestants on the TV show Survivor who acts innocent and helpful and like a member of the team, but really, behind the scenes, he's been pulling strings and playing people off against each other since episode 1. And we can see that here in Genesis very clearly if we just turn back a few pages and look at Genesis 25, where Jacob begins by cajoling his elder brother Esau into giving up his birthright, that is, his share of the family inheritance. And then in Genesis 27, we see that Jacob was just getting warmed up. Now he tricks his father Isaac into giving him the family blessing that was meant for Esau. And just as an aside, it's important for us to understand just how valuable these things were that Jacob has got his hands on. You see, we're not just talking about a better share of the family farm or some nice words said by Dad. We are talking about Jacob taking from Esau, his elder brother, the mantle of family leadership at a time when the family is everything. But wait, there's more. In Genesis 29 and 30, Jacob meets another wheeler-dealer, his future father-in-law, Laban. But in the end, Jacob even gets the best of him, leaving in a hurry with Laban's 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, Laban's 11 grandchildren, most of Laban's animals, and even Laban's household gods are along for the ride. No wonder people are out to get Jacob. No wonder Jacob doesn't know what to do when after all of this, after all the conniving and the wheeling and the dealing and the fast talking, he's confronted by Esau and his private army. Now, I have to admit, and this may just be the older brother in me talking, but there's something kind of satisfying about this moment. There's something that even feels a little bit like justice. But even so, it's hard not to feel at least a little bit sorry for Jacob. There's also something very sad here, very sad and pathetic about seeing someone who always has all the answers and can work all the angles, finally, at the end of their rope. Downfalls. Downfalls, no matter how richly deserved, they're hard to watch, aren't they? I mean, just think of your favorite celebrity squirming under the spotlight as their marriage comes apart. Or the famous athlete failing a drug test or self-destructing off the field. You see, downfalls remind each of us that the good things in our own life may not be as secure as we think they are. As the saying goes, there but for the grace of God go I. Downfalls remind us of that. Well, the good news is that Jacob actually has something more than a downfall to show us this morning. Because in this moment, this ultimate moment when it looks like the chickens are coming home to roost, Jacob has one last trick left. In his moment of absolute crisis, Jacob goes to God. He wrestles with God. He won't let go of God without a blessing. Look at verse 24 here in Genesis 32. And it says, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Now to be clear, this isn't just some kind of ad hoc physical wrestling match that happens. The one Jacob's wrestling with here is clearly much, much more powerful than he is. You can see that in verse 25. With just a touch, he puts Jacob's hip out of joint. Instead, friends, this is a spiritual contest. And not a contest for even spiritual mastery, because Jacob would lose that too, but for something else. This is a contest for a blessing. I will not let you go, he says, unless you bless me. Jacob tells the man he is wrestling against this in verse 26. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now there's some irony to this, isn't there? I mean, remember, Jacob's wheeling and dealing, the seeds of his potential downfall really go back 20 years when instead of going to God for a blessing, he bilks his older brother Esau out of his blessing. And Isaac's blessing on Jacob, Isaac is their father, no doubt, in large part because of how he got it. Isaac's blessing on Jacob turns out to be pretty worthless, doesn't it? In fact, worse than worthless. It was his brother Esau's anger over the whole debacle that sent Jacob to Laban 20 years ago, a refugee. And while Jacob is returning home to his family now pretty well set up, he's got wealth, he's got a family, he didn't actually get any of this as a result of the birthright or the blessing. In fact, Esau probably got the birthright because Jacob wasn't there to receive it when Isaac died. And now, with Esau approaching Jacob with his 400 men, it must be obvious to Jacob just how worthless all that wheeling and dealing has been. How worthless that stolen birthright and blessing have been. All Jacob seems to be getting out of the deal in the end is an armed and angry older brother. It must be obvious in this moment that Jacob needs a different sort of blessing. Not one taken by force or trickery from family or his father-in-law, but one given freely by God. In his moment of crisis, the fords of this little river called the Jabbok, Jacob is finally willing to seek the blessing he needed all along. I will not let you go unless you bless me, he says. Friends, you reached a point in your life like Jacob finds himself here this morning? Have you reached a moment when you are at the end of your own resources, when the chickens are coming home to roost, when you don't have a strategy left to get you through? My guess is almost all of us have been there. And if you have not been there yet, take this as a warning. You probably will be. Now, of course, my hope is that we didn't get ourselves in that spot because we've been wheedlers or wheelers and dealers like Jacob. But however we got to that place, hear this. In this moment, the best thing to do, really the only thing to do, is what we see Jacob finally do here. Stop trying to figure it out on our own, and instead go to God for the blessing that we need. And not only go to God for this blessing, but keep going to him. Hang on to him as long as necessary. We all need to say to God in our hardest moments what Jacob says here. I will not let you go. And we can all pray that second verse of Psalm 121, which we heard this morning. My help comes from the Lord. In fact, it's this that Jesus is also talking about in Luke 18, our gospel reading this morning. And we'll take a moment and just talk briefly about that. See, in Luke 18, he says in verse 1 that we ought always to pray and not lose heart, right? You see, in the story, Jesus tells to illustrate that idea, his main character is a poor widow. And of course, she's much more sympathetic than conniving Jacob. But essentially, friends, they are both doing the same thing. Coming before the judge, coming before the one that can bless them, even wrestling with him in their time of crisis. Now, this gets a bit obscured in the English, but there's even actually a connection to this image of conflict, of fighting. Remember, it says in verse 6, the judge says, I will give her justice so that she won't beat me down. That sounds like kind of a nice metaphorical phrase, right? But what that says, if you were to take it literally, is I'll give her justice so that she won't give me a black eye. We're talking about a fight here. Sometimes, friends, hanging on to God, demanding a blessing, really does feel like a wrestling match. And that's okay. It's in the Bible. So we go to God. We refuse to let go. We even wrestle with him rather than look somewhere else for the blessing that we need. But really, what does that actually look like in real life? What do we have left when we kind of strip the metaphor away here and actually try to do this now? Well, I thought a lot about this. And I think a good example comes from the life of an Anglican priest by the name of John Newton. You've heard of John Newton, I suspect. Preachers love John Newton. He's got a great story. He wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, which is one of those hymns that almost everyone knows at least a little bit of. And most people know that before he was a priest and a hymn writer, Newton was an English sea captain and, in fact, a slave trader. But what most people don't realize is that his story is a little more complex than some kind of moment of conversion after which everything is different. You see, Newton began to cling to God in a moment of crisis during a storm on one of those slaving voyages. And God got him, and he got his ship through that storm. But friends, the change in Newton, the process of wrestling with God for Newton, was not actually all at once. For years after that moment, he said, and this is a quote, his life was a mixture of despair and impatience. Newton would not let go of God, who he met in that storm. But it took years and struggle for Newton to make changes in his life that he knew that God required. In fact, it took him 6 years to leave his ship after that moment. to leave his ship behind and fully receive the blessing God had for him of a transformed life. A life that instead of being defined by this mixture of despair and impatience, sang Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. Friends, it's often the same for us. Wrestling with God for a blessing usually takes more than a night, doesn't it? In fact, in Jacob's own case, it's the culmination, it's the conclusion of 20 years of looking elsewhere for a blessing. But the wrestling begins wherever and whenever we arrive at an understanding that whatever we are facing, we need to overcome it is not some kind of better strategy or a trick, but God and his blessing. And the blessing begins when we can say to God what Jacob said to him on that lonely night at the ford of the Jabbok. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Amen.